I can still hear her voice, soft and pleading, echoing in the dead silence of my apartment. It started with a phone call. A mistake, perhaps. But mistakes don't feel like icy fingers wrapping around your throat, do they? It was 2:33 a.m. when my phone buzzed. Bleary-eyed, I glanced at the screen. Unknown caller. I answered it, annoyed. Help me. The voice was faint, desperate, a woman's voice. Before I could respond, the line went dead. Thinking it was a prank, I tossed my phone aside, but sleep evaded me. That voice lingered, crawling under my skin. By the next evening, the calls came again. This time, the voice was clearer. They're hurting me. Please. Save me. I tried to press for details. Who? Where? Why? But she only sobbed before the line cut off. The third call changed everything. I heard screams. Blood-curdling, guttural cries of someone being torn apart. My stomach churned. The address she gave was in the middle of nowhere. Against my better judgment, I drove out there, the chilling screams replaying in my mind. It was an old farmhouse, barely holding itself together under the weight of time. The door was ajar. I stepped inside, flashlight in hand, heart pounding like a war drum. The smell hit me first, coppery, rotten. Then this sight. A body dangled from the ceiling, its skin peeled back, strips of flesh hanging like macabre streamers. Blood pooled beneath, soaking into the wooden floor. Help! Me! The voice whispered from deeper inside. I followed the sound to the basement, each step down creaking with warning. The air grew colder, heavier. The room was a torture chamber straight out of hell, hooks, chains, and tools caked with dried blood. In the center, a woman sat, tied to a chair, her face hidden by her matted hair. You came, she whispered, voice trembling. Before I could respond, I felt it, a sharp sting at the back of my neck. Everything went dark. When I woke, I was strapped to a chair. The woman stood before me, her face now her smile was twisted, her eyes glinting with a sadistic delight. You answered my call, she purred, dragging a blade across my arm, peeling the skin as if she were unwrapping a present. I screamed, but the sound only made her smile wider. You see, she said, leaning in close, I don't need saving. I am the one who saves. Saves people like you from their dull, meaningless lives. She wasn't alone. Shadows moved in the room, figures emerging with tools, hammers, saws, drills. They took their time. Every cut, every blow, every scream was savored. My nails were ripped out one by one. My teeth shattered with a mallet. They carved words into my chest, mother's call. Each moment felt like an eternity. The woman orchestrated it all, her voice soft and comforting, as though this was a kindness. You're special, she cooed, holding my severed finger like a prize. You answered when no one else would. I wasn't the first. The basement walls were lined with photos of others who had answered her call. Some faces were familiar, people who had vanished without a trace, but she made one mistake. She untied one of my hands. As she leaned in to whisper another lie, I grabbed a shard of glass from the floor and drove it into her throat. Her eyes widened, blood spurting as she stumbled back. The others lunged, but adrenaline made me faster. I grabbed a crowbar and swung wildly, smashing bones and faces. Somehow, I clawed my way out of that house of horrors, leaving a trail of blood behind me. I told the police everything. They found the farmhouse but no bodies, no tools, no evidence, just a pristine, empty space. Then the call started again. Not for me, but for others. The news is filled with stories of missing people, their last known action answering a phone call in the dead of night. And now, as I write this, my phone buzzes again. Unknown caller, I don't think I'll answer this time. The ringing stopped after a few seconds, and silence enveloped my I thought it was over. I thought refusing the call meant I was safe. But at 3 a.m., the sound of heavy breathing filled the room, not from the phone, but from just outside my bedroom door. I grabbed the closest thing I could find, a lamp, and tiptoed toward the door. The creak of the hinges sounded like a scream in the silence. No one was there, but the phone on the table lit up, showing another unknown caller. This time, the message wasn't a voice. It was a video, shaking. I played it. The screen showed a young man tied to a chair, gagged with duct tape, his eyes bulging with terror. The camera panned, revealing her, the woman with the twisted smile. She held a blowtorch in one hand and a pair of pliers in the other. "Hello, dear," she said, staring directly into the camera. You didn't answer my call, so I had to find someone else. She stepped closer to the man, grabbing his hand. One by one, she clapped the pliers onto his fingers, ripping the nails out with slow, deliberate jerks. He screamed against the gag, his body thrashing in agony. Blood streamed down his fingers, pooling beneath him. This could have been you, she cooed. But don't worry, I'll come for you soon enough. The video ended abruptly, leaving me in stunned silence. I tried calling the police again, but they didn't believe me. Another prank, sir? Maybe lay off the horror movies for a while, the officer said, chuckling before hanging up. That's when the knocking started. It wasn't loud, just a soft, deliberate tapping on the front door. I froze, every instinct screaming at me to stay silent. But the knocking persisted, growing louder, more insistent. I crept to the door and peered through the peephole. Nothing. No one was there, but when I turned around, she was inside. She moved like a shadow, silent and swift, her face inches from mine before I could react. Something sharp pierced my neck, and darkness swallowed up in her basement again, my wrists and ankles bound tightly to a chair. This time, I wasn't alone. 3 others were tied up nearby, a middle-aged man, a young woman, and a teenager. All of them looked beaten, their faces swollen and bloodied. Oh, good, she said, stepping into view. You're awake. I thought I'd lost you for good. She smiled, holding up a scalpel that gleamed under the dim light. You didn't answer my call, so now I get to make this personal. She started with the man. His screams echoed as she carved deep gashes into his chest, peeling the skin back layer by layer. Blood dripped from her hands, staining the floor in crimson streaks. Do you know why I do this? She asked, turning to me as she plunged the scalpel into his thigh. It's because people like you, people who ignore cries for help, need to be reminded what it feels like to suffer. The woman next to him sobbed uncontrollably, her pleas for mercy only fueling the sadistic glint in the killer's eyes. When she finally turned to me, I was shaking uncontrollably. You've been such a good sport, she said, running the blade across my cheek. But now, it's your turn. She started small cuts along my arms, the sting sharp and immediate. But then she pulled out a pair of bolt cutters. No, I whimpered, struggling against the restraints. She didn't say a word, only smiled as she positioned the cutters around my pinky finger. With a sickening crunch, she severed it. I screamed, my vision going white from the pain. Shoo, she whispered, pressing a finger to her lips. Save your energy. We're just getting started. But before she could continue, the teenager broke free. Somehow, he'd loosened the ropes around his wrists. He grabbed a jagged piece of metal from the floor and lunged at her, stabbing her in the side. She howled in pain, staggering backward. The woman seized the opportunity to kick over a table full of tools. Run! The teenager shouted, cutting me loose as the killer struggled to regain her footing. I grabbed a crowbar from the scattered tools and swung it with every ounce of strength I had, hitting her square in the face. Blood sprayed as she crumpled to the ground. We made it out of the house and into the woods, our breaths ragged, hearts pounding. But something inside me snapped. I couldn't just leave. She'll do it again, I said, turning back toward the house. She'll keep doing it. The others tried to stop me, but I didn't listen. I found her crawling across the blood-soaked floor, clutching her side. Please, she whimpered, her voice suddenly small and fragile. Don't kill me. I smiled, a cold, mirthless smile. You always said people need to learn what it feels like to suffer. And then I made sure she did. For hours, her screams filled the night as I returned every ounce of pain she had inflicted on me and countless others. When it was over, the farmhouse was silent, her twisted games finally brought to an end, or so I thought. A week later, I received another call. This time, it was a man's voice. Hello, he said, his tone eerily calm. She was my mother. And now, I'm coming for you. The line went dead, and I knew my nightmare was far from over. His words hung in the air like a noose tightening around my neck. She was my mother. And now, I'm coming for you. I tried to convince myself it was just another cruel joke, but the dread clawing at my gut told me otherwise. I barricaded every door and window in my apartment. I didn't sleep. I didn't eat. My mind replayed every horrific scream, every agonizing second from that cursed farmhouse, but no amount of preparation could stop him. It started 3 nights later. A package arrived on my doorstep, wrapped neatly in plain brown paper. No return address. My heart hammered as I tore it open. Inside was a severed hand, her hand, the one I had shattered with a crowbar, clutched in her cold, lifeless fingers was a phone. It buzzed. I hesitated but answered. Did you think it would end there? The man's voice asked, calm yet dripping with malice. You took her from me, and now I'll take everything from you. The call ended, but the phone stayed in my hand, its screen flashing a live video feed. It showed my sister. She was tied to a chair, her mouth gagged, her eyes wide with terror. Behind her stood a man, a giant of a figure, his face obscured by a blood-stained mask. In his hands, he held a chainsaw. You have 1 hour, a text message flashed on the phone. Come to the address, or she dies. I had no choice. My sister was all I had left. The address led me to an abandoned slaughterhouse on the outskirts of town. The place reeked of decay, and the echoes of dripping water played tricks on my mind. The front door creaked open, revealing a trail of blood smeared along the floor. I followed it, each step heavier than the last. My sister's muffled screams grew louder, urging me forward. I found her in the center of a dimly lit room, still tied to the chair. But as I rushed toward her, the floor beneath me gave way. I landed hard in a pit, the impact knocking the wind out of me. Around me were jagged metal spikes, some already impaled with rotting. Sharp pain shot through my leg. One of the spikes had grazed my calf. Blood seeped into my jeans, but I managed to crawl out, using a rope ladder that dangled mockingly nearby. Above, the man waited, his mask reflecting the dim light. Welcome, he said, his voice distorted. Let's see how much pain you can endure. He didn't kill me right away. That would have been too kind. Instead, he unleashed a series of horrors designed to break me, physically and mentally. The first was a maze of barbed wire. I had to crawl through it, the jagged edges tearing into my flesh with every movement. By the time I reached the end, my arms and legs were ribbons of bloodied skin. Then came the room of hooks. Dozens of them dangled from the ceiling, their points glinting ominously. The task was simple: retrieve a key hanging on the far wall. But the moment I stepped inside, the hooks began to swing, controlled by unseen mechanisms. One tore through my side, another ripped at my shoulder. I bit back screams, knowing he was watching, enjoying every second. Finally, I reached the last room. My sister was there, but so was he. She was strung up by her wrists, her toes barely grazing the floor. Blood trickled from a gash on her forehead, and her sobs filled the room. The man held a knife in one hand and a blowtorch in the other. Choose, he said simply. Her or you. I didn't hesitate. Take me. He tilted his head, as if considering my offer. Then he smiled beneath the mask. Wrong answer. He turned the blowtorch on her, flames licking at her skin. Her screams were unlike anything I'd ever heard, piercing my very soul. I fought against my restraints, the chains cutting into my wrists, but it was no use. When her body finally went limp, he turned to me. Your turn, he said. What followed was agony. He started by removing my fingernails with pliers, the pain sharp and relentless. Then he moved to my teeth, smashing them one by one with a hammer. Blood filled my mouth, choking me, but he didn't stop. Next came the branding. He heated a metal rod until it glowed red, then pressed it against my chest. The smell of burning flesh mixed with my screams. Almost done, he whispered, carving something into my back with a scalpel. I didn't know what it was until much later. I don't remember how I escaped. One moment I was on the verge of death, the next, I was stumbling through the woods, covered in blood, my body broken but alive. I found my way to the police station, but just like before, they found no evidence. The slaughterhouse was empty, scrubbed clean of any trace of the horrors within. When I finally saw my reflection, I understood. Carved into my back were the words "Mother's legacy." The calls haven't stopped. Each one brings new horrors, new victims. I've tried to warn people, but no one believes me. Now, as I sit in the darkness, my phone buzzes again, unknown caller, and I know this time, I won't survive. The phone vibrated violently on the table, the screen flashing ominously in the dark. My trembling hand hovered over it, dreading what lay on the other side of the call. Unknown caller. I didn't want to answer, but I knew I had no choice. Ignoring the call would only make things worse. I pressed the green button. Did you enjoy our little reunion? His distorted voice slithered through the receiver. Your pain is just the beginning. I want you to understand what it means to lose everything. Who are you? Why are you doing this? I shouted, tears streaming down my face. He chuckled, low and menacing. You killed her. You took my mother from me. Now, I'll take more than your life, I'll take your soul. The line went dead, but the phone immediately buzzed again. This time, it was a video. The feed showed my best friend, Chris, strapped to a table in what looked like an industrial meat locker. His face was bruised, his shirt soaked in blood. The camera panned to reveal tools laid out beside him, a bone saw, pliers, a branding iron. He's next, the voice said, unless you come willingly. A message appeared on the screen, coordinates sent. You have 2 hours. If you run, he dies slowly. I arrived at an abandoned warehouse deep in the woods, my heart pounding with every step. The faint hum of machinery echoed from inside, mingling with muffled screams, the moment I stepped through the doors. They slammed shut behind me, locking me in. The lights flickered on, illuminating Chris hanging from chains in the center of the room. His body was covered in fresh cuts, blood dripping onto the concrete floor. The masked man stepped into view, holding a scalpel. Welcome back, he said, his voice dripping with mockery. Let's see how far you're willing to go for your friend. Before I could respond, he grabbed Chris by the jaw, forcing his mouth open. Then, with excruciating precision, he began cutting out Chris. Blood sprayed everywhere as Chris thrashed against his restraints, his muffled screams tearing through the room. Stop! I begged, falling to my knees. Please, stop! The man tilted his head, considering. All right. I'll stop for now. But only if you take his place. I didn't hesitate. Do it. Just let him go. He laughed darkly. Oh, you're going to regret that. The next thing I knew, I was strapped to a metal chair, my arms and legs bound with thick leather straps. The man circled me, dragging a rusted blade along my skin. We'll start with something simple, he said, plunging the knife into my thigh. The pain was immediate and searing, but he didn't stop there. He twisted the blade. Tearing through muscle and sinew, I screamed until my throat was raw, but he only smiled. Now, let's play a game, he said, holding up a pair of pliers. For every question you refuse to answer, I'll take a piece of you. He began asking about my life, things he shouldn't have known. My childhood fears, my darkest secrets. When I refused to answer, he started with my fingernails, ripping them out one by one. Each pull was agonizing, the sharp sting radiating through my entire body. Next came the teeth. He pried my mouth open, forcing the pliers around a molar. With a sickening crack, he yanked it out, blood pouring down my chin. Still silent? He taunted, reaching for the blowtorch. He brought the flame close to my skin, hovering just above my forearm. The heat was unbearable, and when he finally pressed it down, the smell of burning flesh made me retch. You'll talk eventually, he said, as he grabbed a scalpel and began carving letters into my chest. I couldn't see what he was writing, but I felt every excruciating stroke. Between sessions of torture, he leaned in close, his masked face inches from mine. Do you know why my mother chose you? I shook my head, tears streaming down my face. She called you because she knew. She knew you were a coward. You'd ignore her cries for help. And now, I get to show the world what happens to people like you. He held up a phone, showing a live feed of my torture. It was being streamed online, the viewer count climbing rapidly. Say hello to your audience, he sneered. Something inside me snapped. I wasn't going to let him win. Summoning every ounce of strength, I yanked at the restraints, ignoring the searing pain in my limbs. The leather began to tear, and before he could react, I broke free. I grabbed a jagged piece of metal from the floor and drove it into his side. He howled in pain, staggering backward. I didn't stop. I tackled him to the ground, slamming his head into the concrete until the mask shattered. Revealing his face, he was young, barely in his 20s. His eyes burned with hatred, but there was fear there too. This ends now, I growled, raising the metal shard. He laughed, even as blood poured from his mouth. It's too late. You'll never escape this. I didn't care. I brought the shard down again and again until his body went limp. I stumbled out of the warehouse, covered in blood, my body broken but alive. The police arrived minutes later, drawn by an anonymous tip. They found the man's body, the tools of torture, and the live-streamed Stone's voice on the phone sent icy needles down my spine. It was soft but sharp, dripping with venom. You thought killing him would save you? Oh, darling, you've just opened the next door. Shall we begin again? Before I could respond, the phone emitted a piercing sound. My head throbbed as if nails were being hammered into my skull. I dropped the phone, but the sound persisted, now coming from all around me. The streetlights flickered, their glow turning blood red. Suddenly, headlights blazed ahead, a black van roaring toward me. I couldn't move, my legs paralyzed by the sound. The van screeched to a halt, and masked figures spilled out, grabbing me before I could scream. When I woke, I was strapped to another chair, this one colder, sharper. My head throbbed, and my vision blurred as I took in my surroundings. It wasn't the warehouse, it was worse. The walls were lined with bones, some broken, some still glistening with remnants of flesh. Chains dangled from the ceiling, and the air was thick with the metallic tang of blood. In front of me stood a new figure, cloaked in black, their face obscured by a porcelain mask carved into the face of a crying woman. You thought you'd killed him, the voice said, the same woman from the phone. But this isn't his revenge. It's ours. She stepped closer, dragging a large leather case behind her. When she opened it, the tools inside gleamed under the dim light: blades, needles, a branding iron, and other devices I couldn't even name. This is where you confess, she said, picking up a scalpel. You took something from us. Now, we'll take everything from you. The first cut was deliberate. She sliced into my arm, peeling back a thin strip of skin like it was fabric. The agony was immediate, raw nerves exposed to the cold air. My screams echoed off the bone-lined walls, but she didn't stop. Each layer of pain brings us closer to your truth. She whipped my hand next, sliding the scalpel under my fingernail. The pressure built as she pried it loose, the nail ripping away with a sickening crack. Blood gushed down my fingers, pooling on the floor. Why did you ignore her call? She asked, her voice deceptively calm. I don't know what you're talking about. I sobbed, wrong answer. She reached for the branding iron, now glowing red-hot. Without hesitation, she pressed it against my shoulder. The smell of burning flesh filled the room as I convulsed against the restraints. You ignored her, the woman said, leaning in. She begged you to help, and you turned away. Tell me, do you feel her pain now? Through the haze of pain, fragments of memory surfaced. A call I had ignored months ago. A woman's voice, desperate, begging for help. I had dismissed it as a prank, too busy with my own life to care. I didn't know. I cried out. I didn't know it was real. Too late, she hissed. Your apathy killed her. Now, let's see what your indifference feels like. She picked up a long needle and slowly drove it into my thigh, the sharp tip scraping against bone. My vision blackened, my screams turning into hoarse gasps. Through the torment, I caught glimpses of others in the room, silent figures watching from the shadows. Their eyes glowed faintly, filled with malice. She wasn't just anyone, the woman said. Circling me. She was our mother. And you left her to die. I choked on my sobs. Please, I didn't know. I'm sorry. Sorry doesn't bring her back, she spat. But don't worry, you'll meet her soon. She pulled out a jagged knife, its edge serrated and cruel. Shall we finish this? Just as she raised the knife, the room plunged into darkness. A deafening crash echoed through the chamber, followed by the sound of chains snapping. The glowing eyes in the shadows vanished, replaced by the sound of footsteps. Someone, or something, whickered back on, revealing chaos. The masked woman was pinned to the ground by one of the glowing-eyed figures, her screams muffled as the figure plunged a shard of bone into her throat. I didn't wait to understand. Summoning strength I didn't know I had, I wrenched free of my restraints and stumbled toward the exit. Behind me, the room erupted into a cacophony of screams and tearing flesh. Whatever had been watching me was now turning on its own. I burst into the night, the cold air stinging my exposed wounds. I didn't stop running until I reached the nearest road. Collapsing in exhaustion, my phone buzzed in my pocket. With shaking hands, I pulled it out. Another video message. I opened it, and my blood ran cold. The camera showed my home. Inside, the masked figures were dragging my sister into the living room, her screams piercing through the sound of screeching tires grew louder, the faint glow of headlights casting shadows that danced like specters on the asphalt. My battered body ached, but adrenaline surged through me, drowning out the pain. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. I stumbled to my feet, clutching a broken shard of glass I'd grabbed from the chamber. If they wanted a fight, I'd give them one they wouldn't forget. The black van came to a screeching halt mere feet away. Its doors slammed open, and the masked figures poured out like a pack of wolves. Behind them, the woman's voice echoed again, this time from the phone in my hand, "You think you can fight us? You're just a coward playing hero. But don't worry, you'll get your wish. We'll bring you home to her." The first masked figure lunged at me, but desperation sharpened my instincts. I ducked low, driving the glass shard into his gut. He let out a muffled cry, blood spilling onto the pavement as he crumpled. The others hesitated, their confidence faltering. "Come on!" I roared, the rage boiling in my veins overpowering my fear. After dispatching 2 more attackers with crude ferocity, I hijacked the van and sped toward my home. My sister's screams still echoed in my ears, and I knew I didn't have much time. When I arrived, the front door was ajar, swinging on its hinges like a mouth waiting to swallow me whole. Inside, the air was heavy with the smell of blood and something far worse, decay. I crept through the darkened hallways, every creak of the floorboards a reminder that I wasn't alone. From the living room, muffled cries drew me closer. My sister was bound to a chair, her face streaked with tears. Surrounding her were the masked figures, their knives glinting in the dim light. "She's here," one of them hissed. From the shadows emerged the woman in the porcelain mask, her cold laughter filling the room. "You've come to save her?" She mocked. Let's see how far your courage goes when you're the one screaming." I didn't wait. I lunged at the closest figure, grabbing a poker from the fireplace and swinging it with all my strength. The sound of cracking bone was satisfying, but it wasn't enough. The others descended on me like vultures, their knives slicing into my flesh. Pain exploded in my side, but I refused to fall. I swung the poker wildly, catching one across the jaw, another in the ribs. The masked woman watched, her head tilted as if admiring a macabre dance. "You fight so hard," she said, pulling out a serrated blade. "But you'll never win. Pain is your destiny." She rushed at me, her knife aimed for my throat. I sidestepped, grabbing her wrist and twisting until the blade clattered to the floor. Before she could react, I drove the poker through her chest. Her scream was unearthly, a sound that seemed to reverberate through the walls. The remaining attackers froze, their courage shattered. "This ends now," I growled, yanking off her mask. Beneath it was a face twisted in rage and anguish, the visage of a woman who had long since crossed the line into madness. Her eyes burned into mine as blood poured from her mouth. "You'll never escape her," she whispered. "You'll always be haunted." I untied my sister, who clung to me, sobbing uncontrollably. The house was silent now, the attackers either dead or fled. But the words of the masked woman lingered in the air like a curse. As we stumbled out into the night, the phone buzzed again. I hesitated before answering. It was the same voice, calm and cold. "You may have survived tonight," she said, "but this isn't over. A mother's love never dies. She's waiting for you. Always." The line went dead, and I hurled the phone into the darkness. Months passed, and life seemed to return to normal. My sister and I moved far away, trying to rebuild. But the scars, both physical and emotional. One night, I sat alone, staring at my reflection in the mirror. My face was pale, haunted by sleepless nights and memories I couldn't escape. Then, the phone rang. I froze, the sound drilling into my mind. It was an unknown number. With trembling hands, I picked it up and brought it to my ear. "Hello?" There was silence, followed by the faint sound of breathing, and then, her voice. "Did you miss me?" The call ended.